My mother handed my sister the keys to our family's $1 million home, while telling me I was a failure in front of everyone we knew. 3 years later, I made sure they'd drive past that same house and realize it was now mine. This is the story of how I went from sleeping in my car to owning the biggest house in Greenwich. They thought throwing me out would break me. Instead, it unleashed something they never expected. By the time my mother stood on my doorstep 3 years later, begging for forgiveness, I had built an empire that made their perfect life look pathetic. The crystal chandelier shimmered like a frozen constellation above our heads, each prism catching and refracting the golden light that spilled across polished silver and crystal glasses. My sister's engagement dinner was the social event of the season in our Greenwich circle, a meticulously orchestrated performance where every smile was rehearsed, every compliment calculated, and every detail engineered to provoke admiration and envy in equal measure. The air itself seemed to sparkle with wealth and privilege, from the imported flowers that cost more than most people's monthly rent to the champagne that flowed like expensive water. And then there was me, the unpolished stone in a sea of glittering perfection, standing beside the table in a simple black dress I'd bought on clearance, holding a champagne flute that felt like it weighed 100 pounds. I tried to make myself smaller, less noticeable. It was a skill I'd perfected over years of living in my mother's house, the art of becoming invisible. My mother, Leslie Moore, stood at the head of the table like a queen holding court. Tall, impossibly poised, with hair that never moved out of place and a smile that never reached her eyes, she was the architect of our family's perfect image. When she tapped her fork against her glass, the room fell into immediate, reverent silence. To my daughter Lisa, she began, her voice dripping with performative pride. The one who is marrying into one of Greenwich's finest families, who just made partner at her firm, who understands what it means to build a proper life, to the daughter who actually made something of herself. The applause was thunderous, the smiles genuine. Lisa basked in the attention, her diamond engagement ring catching the light as she raised her glass. For a moment, I thought that was it, the usual subtle dig, the familiar pattern of praise for her and silent judgment for me. But then my mother's head turned, slowly, deliberately, her eyes locking onto mine with an intensity that made my blood run cold. "And to Mila," she continued, her voice dropping to a conversational tone that somehow carried through the entire room. "The one who didn't." The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the nervous shifting of a guest's chair. I could feel every pair of eyes in the room, on me, some sympathetic, some curious, some openly gleeful at the drama. My mother's smile didn't waver. "We've supported your little hobbies long enough. The coding camps, the sustainable energy conferences, the endless tinkering with gadgets no one will ever buy. It's time to grow up. You're a failure, Mila. A drain on this family's resources and reputation. Get out." The words hung in the air, sharp and final. I saw my sister's barely concealed smirk, my aunt's raised eyebrow, the way my mother's friends suddenly found their napkins fascinating. In that moment, something inside me broke, but not in the way my mother intended. It was the final shattering of the illusion that I could ever earn her approval, that I could ever be enough in her eyes. I stood, my legs trembling but my back straight. I didn't cry, I didn't argue. I simply set down my glass and walked toward the foyer, each step feeling like it was taking me further from a prison I hadn't realized I was in. As I reached for my coat, I heard my mother's voice again, sweet and light as if she were offering dessert. "Oh, and Lisa, darling, a small engagement gift." The metallic clink of keys hitting the wooden table echoed through the silent room. The keys to the house, it's yours. Your father may have indulged Mila's fantasies in his office, but this house, this legacy, was always meant for you. The family home. The place where my father had taught me to code, where we'd stayed up late talking about renewable energy and changing the world. The $500,000 property that represented everything my mother valued, status, wealth, appearance, was being handed to my sister like a party favor. It was the final, brutal severance from my past. I walked out into the cold Greenwich night, the door closing behind me with a soft, final click. The rain had started, streaking the streetlights into blurry halos. I sat in my car, watching the water cascade down the windshield, and made myself a promise I would never again ask for permission to exist. That first night, I slept in the back seat of my 10-year-old sedan, curled into a ball as the storm raged outside. The leather seats smelled faintly of my father's cologne, a ghost of comfort in my new stark reality. I remember watching the raindrops trace paths down the glass, each one feeling like a tear I refused to shed. My mother didn't get my tears. She didn't get anything from me ever again. The following days were a blur of survival. I drove to Brooklyn and found the cheapest studio apartment I could, a 300-square-foot box with peeling paint and a radiator that hissed like an angry snake. The landlord, a tired-looking man with coffee stains on his shirt, barely glanced at me as he shoved the lease across the counter. "First, last, and security," he mumbled, not making eye contact. It took nearly all the money I had. My new kingdom consisted of a cracked laptop, a duffel bag of clothes, and a binder full of my father's old coding notes and our joint projects. That binder became my Bible, my connection to the only person who had ever truly believed in me. The weeks that followed were a masterclass in survival. I lived on instant noodles and cheap coffee, taking any freelance coding gig I could find. I built websites for small businesses, fixed buggy software for startups that paid late, and spent my nights hunched over my laptop in that airless room. Every time I felt like giving up, I'd hear my mother's voice, "You're a failure, Mila," and it would fuel me to work another hour, to send another pitch, to code another line. Meanwhile, my social media feeds were filled with evidence of the life I'd left behind. Lisa in Paris. Charles surprised me with a weekend getaway. My mother at a charity gala, so proud to support the arts with my beautiful daughter. Each post was a tiny, precise cut, but I refused to let them bleed me dry. The turning point came in a crowded Brooklyn coffee shop on a rainy Thursday. I was debugging a particularly stubborn piece of code for a client when I overheard two investors at the next table complaining about the lack of viable, sustainable tech startups. "The city has grant money just sitting there," one said. "Nobody has a real solution for urban energy waste." It was like my father whispered in my ear. I opened my binder to the project we'd called Prometheus, an adaptive solar tracking system that could revolutionize how cities managed energy. His handwriting filled the margins. "Build something real, Mila. Something that matters." That night, I emailed Professor Melinda Jenkins, my old university mentor, who had always seen my potential. I attached the crude prototype I'd been working on and wrote a desperate, heartfelt plea. I expected silence, or at best a polite rejection. Her reply came 3 hours later. "This is revolutionary. Be in my lab tomorrow at 8 a.m. We have work to do." Walking into Professor Jenkins's NYU lab felt like coming home. The chaotic mess of wires, whiteboards covered in complex equations, the smell of solder and coffee. It was my father's office on a larger scale. And that's where I met Misty Ramirez, a prodigy, with grease under her fingernails and a mind that worked at lightning speed. "You code like you're running from something," she said the first time she saw my work. "Maybe I am," I answered. Together, we became an unstoppable force. We spent months in that lab, often sleeping under our desks, surviving on cold pizza and determination. There were setbacks. A crucial capacitor blew during testing, wiping out a week's work. Our first major presentation to investors fell flat. There were days when we both wondered if we were crazy to think we could actually pull this off. But every time I thought about quitting, I'd remember the look on my mother's face when she handed Lisa those keys. And I'd keep going. Our big break came when a local grocery chain agreed to test our software in one store. The manager, Mr. Henderson, was skeptical. 30% reduction in energy costs, or you don't get a dime, he told us, his arms crossed. The month that followed was torture. Misty and I practically lived in that store's basement, monitoring the system, making micro-adjustments, barely sleeping. When the energy audit came back, showing a 32% reduction, Mr. Henderson actually smiled. "You've bought all 10 stores," he said, shaking my hand. That was the moment everything changed. It was no longer my mother's opinion against mine. It was data, results, quantifiable success. The contract with Fresh Fare grocery chain gave us the credibility we needed. And suddenly, investors who had previously ignored us were calling. 3 years after that horrific engagement dinner, I signed the papers for a modern, glass-walled house in Greenwich. Not in my mother's neighborhood, but in a newer, more exclusive development where old money met new innovation. A house was a masterpiece of sustainable design, powered entirely by my own software, a living demonstration of everything green tech solutions could do. The day Lisa drove past was unremarkable until it became everything. She was on the phone, complaining about her divorce settlement, when she saw the house. I watched from my office window as her car slowed, then stopped. Her eyes moved from the solar panels to the discreet plaque by the gate. Green Tech Solutions. CEO Mila Moore. The panic in her voice carried through her closed car windows. "Mom, you're not going to believe this. The house on Elmwood, the tech house everyone's talking about, it's hers. It's Mila's company." She sped away like the demons of hell were chasing her. An hour later, my mother stood at my door, her perfect makeup unable to hide her shock. "You've done well," she whispered, her eyes desperately scanning my home for some flaw, some reason this couldn't be real. "I was wrong about you," she said, and for the first time, I saw genuine regret in her eyes. But the truth was, her opinion no longer mattered. I had built something real, just like my father asked. I had created a life on my own terms, in my own name. The house keys she had given Lisa were to a prison of expectations and appearances. The keys I held now were to freedom. Sometimes the people who are supposed to love you most become the fuel for your greatest transformation. Sometimes walking away isn't losing. It's the only way to win. The morning after my mother's visit, I stood on my rooftop as the first rays of dawn painted the sky in hues of rose and gold. The solar panels began their daily ballet, tilting with silent precision to capture the early light. Below me, my house hummed with quiet efficiency, a symphony of technology and intention that I had built from nothing but determination and memory. A week passed before I heard from Pamela again. "You won't believe what's happening," she said, her voice bubbling with barely suppressed laughter. "Your mother's been removed from the country club board. Apparently, several members felt her values no longer aligned with the institution's mission." Can you believe the irony? I could believe it. The same women who had clapped when my mother humiliated me now found her behavior unbecoming, now that they knew the full story. The gossip chains of Greenwich were merciless, and my success had become the weapon that dismantled my mother's carefully constructed social standing. But what surprised me was my lack of satisfaction. I'd thought this moment would taste sweet, like some long-awaited dessert after years of bitter meals. Instead, it felt empty, like winning a race against someone who had already quit running. 2 weeks later, I received another letter. This one wasn't handwritten, but typed on expensive stationery, though the words carried the same weight of regret. "Mila, I sit in Lisa's old bedroom, writing this. She's moved to a smaller apartment in the city, and the house feels enormous without her. The silence here is different from the silence in your home. Yours feels peaceful. Mine feels lonely. I've been thinking about your father lately, about how he would look at you now. He always saw something in you that I was too blind to recognize. He used to tell me, "Leslie, she's going to change the world someday." I thought he was just being a proud father. I see now he was being prophetic. The women at the club avoid me. The phone doesn't ring as much, and I find myself wondering what any of it was for. The perfect table settings, the right connections, the impeccable reputation. None of it kept me warm at night. None of it comforted me when I was alone. You built something real, just like Zachary wanted. I built a house of cards, and it's finally collapsed in the breeze of truth. I don't expect your forgiveness, but I hope you can understand. I was a product of my own upbringing, repeating patterns I didn't know how to break. That's not an excuse, just an explanation. You were never the failure. I was. Mom. I read the letter 3 times, each reading uncovering new layers of pain and self-awareness in her words. This wasn't the performative apology of someone trying to regain social standing. This was the genuine reckoning of a woman finally facing the emptiness of her own values. That afternoon, I drove to the cemetery where my father was buried. I hadn't visited in years. The pain had been too fresh, the memories too sharp. But standing before his simple headstone, surrounded by the quiet company of other ghosts, I felt a peace I hadn't known was missing. "Hey, Dad," I whispered, placing a small solar-powered light on his grave. "I built something real." The breeze rustled the leaves overhead, and in that moment, I could almost feel his presence, his approval. He'd never cared about wealth or status, only about making a difference. And I had. When I returned home, Misty was waiting for me in the kitchen, 2 cups of coffee steaming on the counter. "You okay?" she asked, her sharp eyes missing nothing. "I'm better than okay," I said, and realized it was true. I'm free. The following month brought unexpected developments. Lisa reached out through a mutual acquaintance, asking if we could meet. I agreed, more out of curiosity than any desire for reconciliation. We met at a neutral coffee shop in the city, far from the prying eyes of Greenwich. She looked different, softer somehow, without the armor of perfect makeup and designer clothes. Her divorce had been finalized, she told me, and she was working as a marketing consultant. "I'm sorry," she said, the words seeming to surprise even her. "For everything. For not standing up for you. For being so blind." She told me about growing up in our mother's shadow, about the constant pressure to be perfect, to be the daughter who made something of herself. "I was so busy trying to be what she wanted that I never figured out who I wanted to be," she confessed. "You were always braver than me. You walked away." We didn't become best friends that day, but we planted a seed of something new. Not the competitive, jealous relationship of our childhood, but the tentative beginnings of understanding between 2 women who had both been casualties of our mother's warped values. As green tech solutions continued to grow, I found myself thinking less about proving my mother wrong and more about honoring my father's legacy. We expanded into 3 new states, partnered with major cities to implement smart grid technology, and were featured in national publications as leaders in sustainable innovation. The house that had once been my statement of defiance became simply my home, a place of peace and creativity. I turned one of the spare rooms into a replica of my father's old office, complete with whiteboards for brainstorming and shelves for his old engineering books. Sometimes, when working on a particularly challenging problem, I'd go sit in there and feel closer to him. One evening, about 6 months after my mother's first visit, my doorbell rang. I wasn't expecting anyone, but the camera showed my mother standing there, holding a small box. She looked older than I remembered, the lines on her face more pronounced without their usual makeup camouflage. "I know I shouldn't be here," she said when I opened the door.
But I found these going through the attic, and I thought you should have them. The box contained my father's old engineering notebooks, the ones I thought had been lost forever. There were also photographs I'd never seen, pictures of him teaching me to code when I was little, both of us grinning at the camera, surrounded by wires and circuit boards. "He was so proud of you," she said softly. "He used to tell everyone who would listen that you were going to change the world." I was too busy being embarrassed that you weren't more like the other girls to see what he saw. We stood there in the doorway, two women bound by blood and history, separated by choices and consequences. The anger I'd carried for so long had faded, replaced by a quiet understanding of the complicated dynamics that had shaped our family. "I can't change the past," she said, "but I want you to know that I see you now, the real you, and she's remarkable." It wasn't a dramatic reconciliation. There were no tears or embraces, but it was honest. And sometimes, honesty is the most healing gift of all. As the seasons turned, I found myself thinking less about the toast that had shattered my old life and more about the woman it had forced me to become. The humiliation that had once felt like a death sentence had actually been a birth, the painful, necessary beginning of my true self. One crisp autumn morning, I stood on my rooftop, watching the solar panels track the sun's movement. The software had been updated again, making them even more efficient. Below me, my house, my sanctuary, hummed with quiet purpose. Beyond my gates, the world continued with all its complexity and beauty.
My phone buzzed with a notification. Another city wanted to implement our technology, another community that would save money and reduce their carbon footprint. Another step toward the future my father had dreamed of, and I was helping to build. I thought about all the people who might be listening to this story. The ones who had been underestimated, dismissed, told they weren't enough. The ones sleeping in their cars or struggling in tiny apartments, wondering if they'll ever make it. The ones hearing voices of doubt, whether from family or friends or their own insecurities, telling them to give up. This is what I want to say to you. Your value is not determined by their approval. Your dreams are not too big. Your voice matters, even when they try to silence it. The most powerful rebellion isn't loud confrontation. It's quiet persistence. It's getting up every morning and doing the work. It's believing in yourself when nobody else does. It's building something real, brick by stubborn brick, until one day you look up and realize you've constructed a fortress they can no longer ignore. Walking away from toxic people isn't admitting defeat. It's claiming victory over the narrative they tried to write for you. Success isn't about proving them wrong. It's about proving yourself right. The people who truly belong in your life will celebrate your light, not try to extinguish it. The ones who matter will recognize your worth without you having to constantly prove it. And the legacy you build from your authentic self will outlast any temporary approval you might have gained by being someone you're not. As I stand here today, surrounded by the life I built with my own hands and mind, I'm grateful for every obstacle, every dismissal, every moment of doubt. They weren't roadblocks. They were stepping stones. They taught me resilience. They taught me strength. They taught me that the only person who gets to define my worth is me. To anyone who has ever been told you're not enough, you are. To anyone who has ever been pushed out, your greatest work is waiting beyond that door. To anyone who has ever had their dreams dismissed, build them anyway. The world needs your light. Don't let anyone convince you to keep it hidden. And remember, sometimes the most beautiful gardens grow from the most barren soil. Sometimes the most brilliant light emerges from the deepest darkness. And sometimes the person everyone underestimated becomes the one who changes everything. Your story isn't over. It's just beginning. Turn the page. As the years unfolded, my life became a tapestry woven with threads of innovation. healing, and unexpected connections. The success of green tech solutions wasn't just measured in financial terms or industry awards, but in the quiet moments of impact. The small town that could afford to keep its library open longer because of energy savings. The community center that installed our systems and saw their youth programs flourish with the extra funding. The families who wrote to thank us for making solar power accessible and affordable. Misty and I grew from business partners into sisters of the heart. We celebrated birthdays, weathered personal storms, and built a friendship that transcended the professional realm. She met someone, got married, and when she had her first child, I stood as godmother, holding this tiny new life and marveling at the circular nature of existence, how from endings come beautiful new beginnings.